Hello, I hope you all had a great Christmas and New Year. I figured that with less than 3 months to go until No Show hits the shelves, and I've got some time on my hands this week before going back to work, I thought I'd do some video content for you and answer some of the frequently asked questions I've received since announcing the book's coming out, along with a few extras. So I've tidied my room, I've shut the cat out of the room, and I've even plucked out a few grey hairs. So I'm ready to go. Let's get cracking. This is going to be fairly unscripted, so I have no idea what the quality is going to be. It could be absolutely interminable. It could be really engaging and interesting for you. I'm just going to see how it goes. So the first question I've got down is, how did you get into writing? I think it's fair to say quite a few of for friends and work colleagues, people who've got to know me quite well over the last 2 or 3 years, didn't really know about my writing and about my background. So I thought I would perhaps give a bit more detail on how I got into writing, why the book came about. So I think it probably all goes back to my teenage years when I was spending a lot of time on internet forums, which for the younger viewers, that is basically social media before formal social media. It's where we would go online to discuss things with other like-minded people. And I started when I was 14, and chatting with a lot of much older people, and enjoyed that kind of writing process. You don't really do instant messaging; it's kind of long form posts, and more and more kind of got into that and realized actually quite enjoy this. Perhaps I could give writing articles a go. So a friend called Scott, who's from Australia, who was running a small motorsport website at the time, was asking for content, and I threw my hat in the ring. I think I was 15 at the time, and started writing articles about motorsport history. It was all fairly basic stuff, but you've got to get practice to get better. And over time, did a bit there, did a few bits and pieces for other places gradually over time. Went to university, did the usual uh, university wannabe journalist thing of writing for the student newspaper, The Bore, and then the student radio station, Raw, um, which I then kind of was involved in for quite a few years. At that time, I still wanted to be a journalist. It was something I was quite passionate about, but I think over time I realized that the kind of media landscape at the time was very uncertain, particularly for sports writing. And B, I think I realized over time I kind of enjoyed the sort of longer form writing, the research side of it more. I tried to do a PhD. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. But alongside all of that, even though I was kind of leaning in that direction, I was still doing quite a lot of part-time writing, started getting paid for a few bits and pieces. And I think the biggest opportunity that I made for myself, and it's important to stress that I made these opportunities, and I think my advice to anyone who has a similar sort of interest and wants to get into it is you do have to be quite proactive with things. You have to knock on a few doors, and get involved as and where you can, get practice in, get the connections. As that I volunteered for a website called Sandals for Goalposts. Um, Salim, the editor, was recruiting extra people ahead of the Africa Cup of Nations. I think it was 2013, so it would have been in 2012 that I reached out. I'd had an interest in African football for a few years and decided, well, I'll give this a shot, and was welcomed into the team. Salim, Mahir, Sam, Tom, quite a few others as well, who were all contributing, were all really supportive. And I think we were all really good at what we did as well. We were one of the few websites that was writing about African and Asian football at that time in the Anglosphere, and writing to a very high standard. Um, and that meant that we were getting recognised then by some of the more mainstream outlets who, whenever there was a big tournament at that time, then they'd kind of look for who the bloggers were who were kind of doing well, the writers that were doing well, and offer them the opportunity to write on the teams that they were the experts in. And what happened for the 2014 World Cup is that quite a few places came to Sandals for Goalposts and said, we want to recruit some of your writers to write about African teams. Now, by then, I'd kind of started down the academia route. I started my PhD, so I was happy to let my colleagues take some of uh, the bigger deals, including write for the Telegraph, which I'm not going to say I regret, but it was one of those things where you probably don't realise that at the time it's like, oh, I could have been a writer for the Telegraph. But what I did get was the Metro. I was writing for Cameroon, on Cameroon for the Metro, which was a deal that was based on how many matches in the tournament they would get to, and I was quite optimistic that maybe they would have quite a few matches, but no, they were terrible and they were out in the first round, so I only got 3 matches. And the same, I was writing for Unibet on Ivory Coast, and then they got knocked out in their last game with the last minute penalty against Greece. So all my paid work dried up after the first round, unfortunately. But it was a fantastic opportunity, and there were lots of other little bits and pieces there as well. It wasn't just the African work. I was doing quite a bit on Torquay United in a few different places as well. Um, so it was a very fun time. But I think particularly after finishing up at uni, dropping out of the PhD, I then got a full-time job in 2016. Finding the time for doing writing alongside that became harder. It was just a case of fitting in the odd blog article here and there, which tended to sort of gravitate more towards the history stuff that I was interested in. That is where the seeds for doing No Show really started. So that kind of leads in nicely into the next question, which is how long have you been working on the book? A lot of people have asked me this, and it's not an easy thing to answer because there's kind of two parts to it, which is one, when I started writing articles on the greatest teams that never qualified for the World Cup, and when did I start writing on it as a book? So the first blog articles that I started writing were in 2018. So I think it was when I was in a brief period of being out of work and was probably procrastinating on doing job applications. And I got into this idea like, oh, it would be really nice to write about the teams that didn't qualify for the World Cup and look at them and see what they might have done had they qualified. Um, so the initial articles were mainly looking at the players and the tactics, manager, giving a bit of context around that. But it was quite football nerdy in a sense of it was quite technical. What I realized as I started doing more and more of them was that, hey, actually, this has got some potential from a storyline perspective rather than a sort of dry technical perspective. Some of these teams have really interesting stories that make a really interesting narrative. And I started to accumulate a bit of a list of teams that I wanted to cover. Unfortunately, it was fairly intermittent given I was then working again not long after. And yeah, after that, I kind of sort of put it to one side. I had this aspiration. I realized that I could turn it into a book. I think it would make a really good book because there is a gap in the market. But it was just a case of finding the time. And it came to the summer of 2024 where I thought, I need a bit of a project. I was kind of having a bit of a lull outside of work and thinking I need something to focus on. And I looked in my files on my laptop, and I'd always had this folder there, writing, and then World Cup teams that never were, and a plan for um, a book proposal without having fully written a pitch for it. And I thought, you know what? We're less than 2 years away from the World Cup. I always said that I would write it so that it would come out just before a World Cup. If I don't do this now, I'm going to have to wait another 4 years. And it might as well be the thing that I can focus on then. for the next few months, the next year or so. You see where it goes. If I don't get a positive response from the publisher that I wanted to pitch to, which was Pitch Publishing, my publisher, then I could potentially look at self-publishing just for the sake of having something out there. I didn't really know what to expect from the publisher, whether or not I'd get a response. Especially given I'd been out of the writing game for so long, I didn't know how much of a reputation I had or whether that would influence it in any way. But yeah, I took myself down to the pub, plonked myself on a table on my own, and bashed out the pitch as per the format that they request, and sent it off, and thought, well, it's probably not going to come to anything, but we'll see what happens. At least I'll get some feedback. Fast forward about less than 3 months. It was about October time. I was sat in the kitchen at work and suddenly got an email through from the publisher in response with a positive response, and I was like gobsmacked and overjoyed. It wasn't for a couple more months then that everything had been kind of sorted contractually and everything. But at that point, then I knew I could start, working towards the deadline of September 25, which then I was able to meet, and that's where we are now, having gone through the whole process of writing and getting a cover, a fantastic cover that Duncan Olner has done. He does, as far as I can tell, a lot of pitches covers, and they're all fantastic, and I really like mine. It's a really distinctive cover that stands out. And then going through the pitch proofreading process with Graham, who was really supportive. So yeah, it's all been a bit of a whirlwind. It's still a bit surreal, the fact that we're sat here now less than 3 months and my book is actually coming out, and it's going to be in shops, and it's already on Amazon, and people are already paying money for it. So yeah, it's a long process that took several years, but it's been really 18 months since it was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. So where the idea came from is, I don't know, I just always had this fascination really with things that never quite happened. I started writing when I was doing a PhD. I was doing a bit of sort of writing in my spare time, um, and around number two singles, and I wanted to turn that into a book as well, and maybe one day I will. But I have this interest in the fact that, like, people talk about number one singles all the time. There are lots of books written about the greatest number one single, TV programs, documentaries. We remember the things that are successful. We don't necessarily remember the things that just miss out, that don't quite have that status. And you can say the same, like, I've got an interest in Formula One. The drivers who didn't race in Formula One for whatever reason, even though they were quite good. I've always really been interested in that. And I guess that kind of leads into the sort of same thing here. Like, what about the teams that didn't qualify for the World Cup, even though they may have been quite good or had a really interesting story? The first line of the book is, history is written by the winners. And it's especially true with the World Cup. Like, World Cups are defined by where they were hosted and who won them. If you ask most football fans, whatever country it is or that they're from, they're going to tell you those two things. Oh yeah, 1982, that was in Spain. It was won by Italy with Paolo Rossi. It beat the famous Brazil team. 1986, oh, that's the Maradona, yeah, hand of God, etc. 1990, oh, Italia 90, Germany winning, beating England, Gascoigne crying in the semi-final. It's the key moments, and the key moments come from deep into the tournament, from the final and semi-finals, and people remember the winners and who the winning players were. If you're a little bit more into football, you might know some of the other storylines, the subplots that were going on. But we're talking about like a sort of mainstream knowledge. It's mainly focused around those big matches because at the end of the day, it's the World Cup final that has the biggest viewing audience out of all of the matches in probably in all of football. Oh, undoubtedly in all of football, not probably. So for me, like the idea of having a book that focused on teams that didn't qualify was is kind of almost like a counter to that. That's reflecting on the things that could have happened but didn't, that nearly happened. Because I know that there's been some stuff on, some of the really small teams like Next Goal Wins, focusing on American Samoa, for instance. But even if you kind of look at some of these books behind me, that side, which touch on the histories of footballing nations, you've got their book on the history of football in Spain, France, um, Ireland, England, Wales. Not necessarily all of them will touch on the times where they weren't as successful. Like the France and Spain books I've got, they're really good books, and this isn't to denigrate them at all. And the same with Spain, Portugal, and I know there are books out there on the histories of Italian football and Dutch football as well. And I kind of flicked through a lot of them, but they don't have a huge amount to say on the times where those countries were not as successful. For them, the narrative is constructed around why these teams are really good at football and why they're really into football. So the times where they didn't qualify, they weren't as successful, don't really fit the narrative. So I get that. And I wanted to write something that would kind of fill that gap. The irony is that once I'd got my publishing deal, I started noticing one or two more books, and even like during the time I was planning it, starting to notice the odd book coming out here and there, which actually focus on um, teams that didn't qualify, including some of the teams that I've been writing about. So I'd already written the England chapter on the England team that didn't qualify for 1978 World Cup under Don Revie. When Chris Evans wrote his book on Don Revie, which covers it in quite a lot of detail, and even more recently, the book that you can see behind me, Lions in the Wilderness, which covers the England team in the 1970s that failed to qualify in 1974 and 1978. Then last year, the book on the Ireland team that didn't qualify in 1982, which you can see behind me, Shattered Dreams, Sliding Doors, which is another really good book. There's also a book on Italy called Cinque Anni, which focuses on the 5 years between 2017 and 2021, where they didn't qualify for the 2018 World Cup and then won the Euros in 2021. And also the book Crash of the Buffalo, which is on the team from Zambia that didn't qualify in '94. All of these being teams that I had covered, and like most, if not all, books coming out after I'd written content for mine on the same teams. So it's just fantastic, and they go into a lot more detail, and I would recommend looking at them. And luckily, I think most of them were out, or I managed to get hold of a copy before my book came out, so I was able to sort of cross-reference things to make sure that what I was writing wasn't a load of guff. But they definitely act as sort of, if you want to know more, my book can be a springboard to that. I think that's how I'm viewing it, and they do take different angles on it. I'd say the Island book here takes a very personal angle. The author who wrote it, Paul Little, writes about it from his own personal experience, and it's really engaging, and it's very much around not just the football but everything around it. So there's kind of that aspect of it was kind of, as I said, filling a gap that I felt was there at the time that has now been partially filled. And at the same time, regardless of what other books have covered, there is definitely no book specifically on teams that have not qualified for the World Cup. So having this as a collection, a themed collection, is very different and very distinctive. So that's all good. And no one has released a book doing exactly that in that time. Otherwise, I'd have been pretty heartbroken. um, but in terms of choosing the teams, how did I choose the teams? So there are 24 teams in the book. Originally, they were going to be 32. I wanted it to be a World Cup number, a number of that's also the number of teams in the World Cup at a certain time. Obviously, we're going up to 48, but it's been 32 for most of my life. 32 seemed the obvious one. I had this idea that it would be very clearly sort of divided up by chapters, where each chapter would effectively be a standalone story. So it kind of works as you can dip in and out of it easily. There's no kind of continuous narrative that you can be dropping in and out of. It just makes it nice. It's nicely broken down into chunks like that. Which in turn also makes it a lot easier to write. It's not like I'm looking for some grand overarching narrative there. Although, as I wrote more and more, there were definitely themes that came through and recurring characters, which was a nice feeling to know that actually this is coherent. My worry was it wouldn't be necessarily the most coherent because it's so bitty. But yeah, I kind of had this idea that, if I do like 4,000 words on each team, 32 teams, it would top out about 120,000 words, which I thought was doable. My publisher came back to me after I pitched it and said 120 is too much, do 80. And I think that was the right choice. It's going to make it quite a nice sized book, 320-ish pages, which is about the same as most of the books by me. A couple of them are longer, as you can see, but it's the sort of book you'll be able to slot into your bag while traveling. It's going to be a hardback book as well, so it's going to be like solid. But yeah, it's not. That meant it wasn't too onerous to write. But what that did mean was I couldn't stick to 32 chapters with a word count of 80. It meant I had to do the very painful decision of reducing the 32 that I had already chosen down to 24, which meant cutting some rather interesting stories. Now, some of them picked themselves. Like when I first started writing these, I started looking at 1994, because 1994, famously within football nerd circles, was the greatest World Cup qualifying campaign overall, without question. It was one of the first where everything was properly televised, I would say, and given like good coverage, but also some very dramatic moments happened, not just in Europe, but in most, if not all, of the confederations. Europe was most famous because there was one night where all the qualifiers ended, and that night was one of the most dramatic in the history of football. It's famous in a few different ways. You've got Graham Taylor's England, which didn't make it into the book, famously conceding within the first 10 seconds to San Marino. You had Paul Bodin missing his penalty for Wales, leading them to defeat against Romania. You had France losing to Bulgaria in the last minute, which is in the book. And Ireland's dramatic qualification for the World Cup as well, where they drew with Northern Ireland and Denmark lost to Spain. Unfortunately, I did write a blog article, a really long blog article, 9,000 words ish, on Denmark, the 1994 Denmark team, because they were European champions, and it was quite a shock that they didn't qualify, and the whole circumstances around it were bizarre. Unfortunately, I didn't have room to put it in, but it's there on my blog, worldcupdnq.wordpress.com, if you want to go and read that. Definitely one of my favorite things that I've ever written, and it was a shame not to be able to include it. So that was Europe. Then in Asia, you had Japan what they call in Japan the agony of Doha, where they lost, they drew in the last minute against Iraq in their final qualifier, which cost them the chance to go to their first World Cup. In Africa, you had the story of the Zambia team, the awful plane crash and their recovery, and narrowly missing out there. Plus Zimbabwe, the dream team in Zimbabwe, famous for being the closest that Bruce Grobbelaar ever got to a World Cup and the closest Zimbabwe have ever got to a World Cup. And then you kind of had other bits and pieces around. It was famously the campaign where Argentina lost 5-0 at home to Colombia, and they were sent into a playoff with Australia, which they narrowly won. Australia had knocked out Canada on penalties in the previous playoff. There was just something everywhere, and I really wanted to get my teeth into the teams that hadn't qualified for that one. So I kind of started doing that, and I kind of moved more initially forward in time through 98 and 2002, which is more my home turf. My first World Cup was 98. And then started kind of filling the gaps after that, accumulating things over time as and when I felt like it, because by then I was working full time and didn't necessarily always have the space to be writing. So when it came to kind of choosing from the book, and initially I wanted to try and include as much that I'd already written as possible, but that wasn't the case. It wasn't possible, and it's because of two things really. One was trying to spread the chapters out across a decent number of World Cups, to try and not put too many in this from the same World Cup, because I wanted to make it a representative of World Cup history, and B, not too 90s focused, which would have been very easy to do, even though for me that's when World Cup qualifying was at its best. I think you've got a situation now where most of the elite nations go through quite easily, especially given that we've now got 48 teams qualifying. Before that, before the 90s, there were fewer teams, and the margin for error was quite low. And yeah, going further back, there just weren't that many qualifiers, and it's also very difficult to get the material for it. So I wanted to spread them out as much as I could. Actually, it was quite difficult to narrow it down so much, because there were some that I was particularly attached to that I really wanted to get in. So in the end, the 80s actually ended up being quite a difficult decade, but I think I've done three or four that happened in the 80s, even if they weren't necessarily for 80s World Cups, because obviously the qualifying for 1990 took place in the 80s. 70s was a tricky one as well. There would have been more for that decade if I'd had the space. I think that will probably come if I do a second one of these. But yeah, they kind of cover from 1958 through to 2022, so it's a nice spread really within the 24. The other thing that I wanted was not to make it too Eurocentric. The temptation is to pick lots of European teams, and indeed it is overwhelmingly Eurocentric anyway. But I wanted to make sure that every continent was represented as and where possible. The one disappointment that I kind of got from it was only one South American team made the cut. I wanted to include another one or two, but again, it's just space and strength of narrative for some of them just wasn't quite enough. So yeah, unfortunately, I'd like to have done one on Uruguay in 1994, as they were up against Brazil, the Brazil team that went on to win the World Cup and very nearly beat them. And Brazil have qualified every time, so that would have been a huge shock and a massive loss to the World Cup in America. And Chile in 2018, which was a massive shock at the time. But in hindsight, it's probably of less significance now. I'd like to do it next time, but yeah, the kind of the juggling that balance of time. Obviously, Uruguay in '94, it's another '94 team. Um, I could have done Uruguay in 2006 when they lost to Australia on penalties. Again, just didn't quite have the narrative thrust for me. And the same for Chile with like fitting it in around the two teams that I already picked for 2018, which are Italy and the USA. Those two were stronger narratives for me. Um, but yeah, other than that, I've included several African teams because they're always really interesting to write about. Um, included Japan representing Asia. I would like to have done a chapter on China in 1990, but I think I realized that finding the material to do that justice was going to be difficult. That probably needs more time. Um, I covered Australia, who are, of course, now in the Asian Confederation, but at the time were in the OFC, the Oceania Federation. Um, and I covered, I think, it's what, two North American teams in the USA and Trinidad and Tobago. So, I tried to sort of spread it out as much as I could. But unfortunately, the big names tend to play in Europe. The big names that have missed out tend to be European. So it is what it is. I think it was just I remember it being a very painful process going through every single team that I'd chosen out of the 32 and working out, does this actually work? Can I research it? Can I do this justice? In some cases, it was a case of, I don't think I can do this justice right now. But definitely makes for something that I can go back to in the future. What are the big themes of the book? So the way I usually explain this is, of the 24 teams, you can usually divide them into one of two camps. One is the teams that you would expect to qualify, the elite nations, who somehow trip themselves up. And that can be elite nations globally: England, France, Spain, Italy, or elite nations within their sphere, within their continent. So the USA, Nigeria, Japan. Or the teams that um, were kind of the minnows, really, who had a good run, who came very, very close to um, a romantic story. And there's one or two of the teams that can kind of come up to cover both. So Japan kind of covers both because now they're one of the elite nations of Asia. At that time, they'd never qualified for the World Cup, and this was their first big chance. But for the most part, it's teams like Liberia, Trinidad and Tobago, Burkina Faso. Um, you got one or two who kind of sort of don't really fit in either, but they're interesting stories. But for the most part, that is kind of how it works from a dynamic perspective, and each of the stories kind of take quite familiar sort of turns where it's like, oh, this is a big team. They've been drawn in a bit of a tricky qualifying group, but you would still expect them to qualify. Oh, look, here are the things they've done that meant they mess it up. Versus, this is the story of a team that kind of worked really hard and has got a really good generation of players. It's kind of built over time, and then they get a really good run of form, and then they're on the verge of it, and then something happens, and it kind of unravels at the end. So spoilers. I think the thing is that like um, I don't have to worry about spoilers because what happens at the end is fairly obvious in the title of the book. So at least I don't have to worry about that. But uh, yeah, it is funny how it all kind of, for the most part, sits in one of those two narrative structures. In terms of the themes within each of those kind of categories, let's say for the big teams that don't qualify, there are running themes of complacency, hubris, at times arrogance, pressure, particularly on managers. You can see in terms of managerial tinkering and uh, and decision making isn't necessarily great, even from some of the greatest managers of all time, like Don Revie and Louis van Gaal are two of those, had enormous success in the club game, turned their hand to international management, doesn't quite work. So there's kind of that aspect of it, and also just misfortune and politics, and that kind of leads into the smaller teams as well. Like there's certainly political aspects to some of these teams, and one or two kind of end in rather conspiratorial situations. That I won't spoil, but um, it's funny how that kind of crops up in a few different places. Now, whether that's a reflection of how a country, particular smaller country, responds to defeat, or whether it is genuinely a running theme within World Cup history. Obviously, we know match fixing and corruption is a big part of football, a big part of the football administrations in the past. No comment on the present day. Uh, but yeah, it is interesting that it comes up in a few different places, which I hadn't fully considered when I'd chosen the teams. Some of the bit was new to me when I was researching. Um, but also like the sense of like countries getting behind their teams for the most part, like particularly with the small nations, how big a deal it is. For instance, for Trinidad and Tobago when they nearly qualified in 1990, how the whole country rallied behind them. For Liberia in 2002, you get a real sense of um, how big this is for that country. I hope I've tried to. Oh, I've tried to convey that as best I could. I hope I have. Um, and I think that probably sums it up quite well. That you realise that it's this kind of sense of the importance of the World Cup to both the elite nations and the nations, the smaller nations, um, as well. You kind of realise this is massive for them, particularly those countries that don't have a sporting heritage, and football is their national sport. There are other countries where they have other sports that they compete in, but for Burkina Faso and Liberia, and to a lesser extent for Trinidad and Tobago, because Trinidad and Tobago have cricket and they have athletics. That so much was put on this because it's their national sport, but at the same time, it's not a sport they've ever been particularly good at least in a global sense. What is my favorite story from the book? So I was thinking about this earlier. I think there are articles that I enjoyed writing that aren't necessarily the best stories. I really enjoyed writing the Argentina 1971, which I wasn't expecting to because it was the one that I knew the least about and didn't have as much material to work with. I had to do quite a lot of research on it, but there came a lot of satisfaction from being able to get my head around everything and turn it into a coherent story. I think the story of Trinidad and Tobago is a great story that has a very unfortunate ending. I think the Zambia story is incredibly inspirational and again very sad, both from a sense of obviously what happened with the plane crash, but the fact that they then weren't able to qualify for the World Cup and lost in the Africa Cup of Nations final. It's just everything about this book, and it's another running theme. Really, it's kind of like the narrative. The narrative always ends up being incomplete and, or in some respects, unsatisfying because you want these teams to qualify, particularly those smaller nations, and then you kind of have, I don't know, I find at times where I was like almost suspending belief. And we're like, oh, yeah, but maybe this time they will actually qualify. And then you realize that no, they're not going to. That's the whole point of the book. The Liberia story is fantastic. I almost think it's probably my favorite, and I think it's because it's this mix of like cool runnings with Sunday League football, in that you've got George Weah, who is this incredible player, who's the best player in the world. He's getting on a bit. He's at a career crossroads. This is his last chance really to do anything with Liberia on the global stage. He's got this collection of players around with him who are all, let's face it, nowhere near as good as he is. He's acting as their coach. He's acting as their agent to try and get them clubs. He's paying for the equipment, and he's the captain of the team. He's playing himself out of position to allow other players to play in their best position, because that's the way he can best make the most of the abilities of the players that he's got. And you almost get this fantastic story of them reaching the World Cup ahead of Nigeria, who, I love Nigeria, right? As a footballing country, particularly when I was growing up, they had a fantastic, exciting team. And I remember them in that World Cup, and I was so disappointed with how bad they were, even in getting a 0-0 draw with England. Um, and you kind of think, oh, well, we almost got that fantastic story. And I guarantee you, if Liberia had qualified, regardless of what they'd done in the World Cup, that would have been a film by now, or a book, or something. But because they didn't qualify, it kind of becomes this very unsatisfying um, conclusion. And the narrative kind of flips on its head, because you think, oh, if you didn't know any better, you'd be reading it thinking, oh, this is where they all come together and they succeed. And like, no, they bottle it, and the crowd turns on them and starts gathering outside their hotel to abuse them. And George Weah announces his retirement, and does it very quickly, and then gets accused of match fixing and like deliberately throwing it so that Liberia don't qualify, so that Charles Taylor can't go to the World Cup, allegedly, which I think is probably nonsense, but that is what people believe. Plus, also this kind of whole aspect of maybe Nigeria's last game was fixed as well, which has come out in the years since. And it kind of leaves you feeling a bit cold. It's like, this was almost a really good story, and it wasn't. And that's what you get. It's like there are lots of these type of stories where it's like this feels thematically like it ought to finish in one way, but it doesn't, because unfortunately not everything has a happy ending. So I think it's the minnows that tend to have the best stories, with one or two exceptions from the elite countries where um, particularly the hubris is really on show. Um, and there is one that kind of stands out, and it's also the team that answers the next question, which is the greatest team that didn't qualify for the World Cup. The answer I always give is France in 1994, and it was one of the first teams that I wrote about for that very reason. Here is a team where they're coming out of the ashes of the great 1980s France team that had declined, who had left a void after Michel Platini retired, after the other players around him had retired. They'd not qualified for Euro 88 or the 1990 World Cup. They'd gone to the 92 Euros and been very disappointing. But there was a sense that things were starting to come together. Some young players were coming in as well, particularly defensively. Um, but, in particular, this team revolves around the two very talented strikers that they had in Jean-Pierre Papin and Eric Cantona. Jean-Pierre Papin, one of the best players in the world at the time. Eric Cantona, in the process of becoming an enormous star, the first really big star of the Premier League era. You get the sense of this team coming together with Gerard Houllier as manager, who had already been very successful. Obviously, went on to have a great career in England with Liverpool as well. This is when he's still a bit unfamiliar to British football fans, I would say. and they start off really badly against Bulgaria, but then they get a really good run going. And you kind of think, oh, well, they're going to qualify easily. I imagine that's what people thought at the time. With 2 games to go, all they needed to do was win one of them, and they're both at home, and they're against Israel and Bulgaria. And you think, well, they should qualify. It's France. You look at the players they've got. You look at the manager they've got. Yeah, this is them on the verge of coming back to the World Cup after missing the previous one. 98, the next one's going to be in France. Pele's there. Who's who in France is probably there watching. All of the focus of the nation's on it. France as a footballing nation probably underachieved by that point. And you think, well, maybe this is all coming together. And then they'd blow not one, but 2 games in the last minute. It's incredible. And if you look at the teams that qualified ahead of them, Sweden and Bulgaria both made the semi-finals. And France were better than them. Oh no, they lost to Bulgaria twice. But for the overall sort of pattern of the group in terms of the matches that played, like, France were the best team in the group. And it was pure mental block that they didn't win at least one of those last 2 games, or at least even get the draw against Bulgaria. And you look at the talent in the squad and what they went on to do. The core of the team behind the front two, who were eased out not long after, went on to win the World Cup in '98 and the Euros in 2000. So the ability was quite clearly there. Maybe those things don't happen without the failure of '94. That's a whole debate. But it was the particularly bizarre circumstances that it happened, and the performances up until that point. To me, it kind of says that if they'd gone to the World Cup, if they'd managed to hold out, I think they would have done really well. I think they might even have won it, because '94 was not a particularly strong World Cup. A lot of the better teams underperformed, and they were better than 2 teams that got to the semis. And it was a World Cup that was based around talismanic players. Brazil won. Romario did a lot of the heavy lifting. Italy were in the final almost entirely because of Roberto Baggio. You had Georgi Hagi with Romania. You had Hristo Stoichkov for Bulgaria. All of the teams that did well were the teams that were being not quite carried, but were built around one particular player. Eric Cantona fits that mold entirely. Eric Cantona gets almost unfairly maligned these days in the revisionist view of 1990s football, because he was the first big star, but it was a time where the Premier League wasn't of the standard that it was 5 years later. And he never did much at international level. He played in one major tournament and didn't score. I think that was his moment, that he could have really grasped that World Cup. And he could have made him a global superstar rather than just a superstar in England. He's the temperament of player that could have done really well. And in that moment, through no fault of his own, they didn't make it. And he never got that chance. Then a few months later, he kicked a fan, was banned. And when he came back from his ban, a few months later, France had moved on. They'd started picking Zinedine Zidane. Aimé Jacquet built the team around Zidane's creativity instead. And, Zidane was a better player than Cantona, don't get me wrong. But it just kind of means that sliding doors moment for Cantona, his window was very, very short. And he didn't quite get that chance to show what he could do against the best in the world. And that's why there's always this kind of question now, and a lot of people hold it against him that maybe he wasn't that good because we never got to see him be good. I think there are other teams up there as well, though, alongside France. The Spain 1958 team, one of the most talented teams ever, with that front four of Gento, Suarez, Di Stefano, and Kubala. That is a super team. It's the sort of team you see now in terms of the depth of attacking talent. But it wasn't a complete team, as far as I can tell. And it was a team that was just coming together for that very, very short World Cup qualification group. I think if you have a sort of modern day length of group, so 8, 10 matches, Spain probably qualify, but they had 4 matches. And the damage was already done after 2. So I think that was a missed opportunity. I think if they had a bit of more of a campaign, they'd been able to grow into it. They probably would have qualified, and then I think when it came to the finals a year later, they'd have been a lot more ready, and maybe we'd have seen the Di Stefano versus Pele match. The greatest player of the 50s against the greatest player of the 60s. That would have been the most appropriate thing. That would have been the best from a narrative conclusion. But once again, the narrative ends in a very unsatisfying way. And then the other one that stands out for me is the Netherlands team of 2002. Not just because of the players, that the players are incredible. They'd proven they could do it. They'd got to semi-finals in the previous 2 tournaments. But also the manager, Louis van Gaal, was at the time considered one of the sort of 3 or 4 best managers in the world. It seemed a natural fit. He had managed the players, or a lot of the players, at Ajax when they were much younger, and they'd now developed into superstars. And yet, there's a sense of so many things going wrong. And start the campaign with a lot of players out injured. They have the drug suspensions for Edgar Davids and Frank de Boer. And Van Gaal's naivety, his tactical naivety, his naivety in some of the things that he said, it just didn't work. And also the fact that they were unfortunate to come up against an Ireland team who took every chance that they got. Ireland had come very close a few times previously. They'd lost in the previous 3 playoffs. But Mick McCarthy turned them into a really organised team who, actually won every game that they needed to. Previously, Ireland teams that have tripped up here, they shouldn't have, and same after as well. Whereas they were genuinely clutch in that one. I think they only lost. Did they only lose 1 game? It was remarkably consistent, and that was the thing. You can get away with a few mistakes here and there in qualifying sometimes if you're up against a team or teams that are also making mistakes. But in that group, Portugal and Ireland were both pretty much perfect, and that left it all coming down to that match in Dublin, which is one of the most famous World Cup qualifying matches ever. And I would implore you to seek that match out. And I hope the book does a good job of selling it. I did watch it all the way through for the book for research purposes. It's a fun game. And as a result of that, then there's so many great players in that touch side who we don't. It's not that we don't see them at a World Cup; is that even when we see them at next to the major tournament in Euro 2004, quite a few of those players have passed their peak. I I don't know. I can't say for certain if they'd got to the World Cup under Van Gaal, whether they'd have been contenders. I mean, that 2002 World Cup was a bit of a mess because so many players were injured or half fit because it'd been so tiring and the conditions were so humid and hot. But I think if they'd gone to that World Cup under another manager who was astute and didn't suffer fools gladly. Not that Van Gaal suffers fools gladly. That's the wrong phrase. He wasn't making the same mistakes, I guess, both tactical and in the way that he conducted himself. They probably would have done quite well, but It's hard to say, really. It was kind of a bit top heavy. In theory, they had depth everywhere, but it doesn't necessarily always work out. So you can say the same for Portugal in '98. You look at that team; they had depth in all the areas of the pitch, and yeah, it just didn't quite work. Sometimes it just doesn't. It's that you think you've got the players, but it's not necessarily just about the individual players. It's about how they come together as a team. And sometimes the teams that come together the best are the ones that then the players aren't quite as talented, but they know what they're doing. I've got the book here on not a World Cup team, but a Euros team. This is the Miracle 04 by Vasilis Sambrakos, which is on the Greece team that won Euro 2004. Classic example of a team where the players themselves weren't the most talented, but everyone knew what they were doing. They were so well drilled by Otto Rehhagel. And I've always said the same about that other countries should be aspiring to do that. I think we now kind of get to a point in football where system football is sort of norm now. It's a different sort of system than what Greece were doing, but I think there's a sense of like the best players are the ones that work together. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. There was still this focus on individuals. But, I'd kind of made the case at the time with England as a teenager where it's like, well, maybe some of these superstars should be dropped and you pick more limited players, but at least they can do what they're doing. There's no reason why England shouldn't have won Euro 2004 or 2006 World Cup. They had the players within England to do it. They had English players that could have done that. Maybe not quite in the same way as Greece, but that's the thing for me. You kind of see big nations struggling. In this book, we look at Italy in 2018 and in the years since. You think must have some players who can just do a job, but there's so much pressure from the media, from the federations, from sponsors sometimes to pick certain players. And maybe that's the whole thing we can get into looking into the World Cup this summer is who can win and who will win. They're two different things, and there are so many teams who are capable of winning, but will the teams gel in the right way in the moment? But I think that covers all of the questions that I wanted to cover. If you have any further questions, please drop them in the comments below. Please do the usual thing of like, comment, share, follow the page. It's all much appreciated. Activity is going to be ramping up now. The book will be coming out on the 30th of March. I'm going to do some in-person events starting in mid-March. Hoping to do a few around the country. I'm going to try and get on some podcasts and some other content. Is maybe a magazine appearance or two within that as well. But the best way of getting reach these days is via social media and promoting that way. So anything you can do to promote and to help me promote this would be much appreciated, whether it be on social media or just telling people in person by word of mouth. Word of mouth remains a very powerful way of selling things. But otherwise, it's been nearly an hour. It's been a little longer than I thought. Thank you for those who have stuck at it, and I will bring you some more content soon.